All right, from 1 Samuel chapter 17, we have these words. Verse 1, Now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled at Soko in Judah. When you look over there, top of that hill, those are the ruins of Soko. All right, it says that they pitched their camp between Soko and Azekah. Even though you can't quite see it over there now, it's directly behind us back there. There's a tell there called Azekah. Saul and the Israelites assembled and camped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. So it says they gathered their forces to war at Soko, so we're going to assume that the Philistines were over there and Saul and his men were on this side. The Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another. So even though it says they met in the valley of Elah, they were actually on the hills. The Philistines occupied one hill, the Israelites another, with the valley between them. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, which is a town not too far from here, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. So that would make him what? Over 9 feet tall. He had a bronze helmet on his head, wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000. Bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us. Then the Philistines said, This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other. On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. What direction would you imagine Bethlehem to be from here? Anybody know? Okay. Where's everybody pointing? Okay. This is south. This is west. The sun's going down there right now. This is east. This is north. Bethlehem's that direction. And of course, we were there today. And we had to come back up to Jerusalem, then out west, and then drop back down into this valley from the north. So Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time he was very old. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war. The first was Eliab, the second Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep in Bethlehem. That's why Bethlehem, is called the city of David, because David was raised there. For 40 days the Philistines came forward every morning and evening and took his stand, the Philistine, meaning Goliath. Now Jesse said to his son David, Take this roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to the camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit. See how your brothers are and bring back some assurance from them. They are with Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah fighting against the Philistines. But I don't think they were doing much fighting, right? It was a stalemate. Philistines wouldn't come up here. The Israelites wouldn't go down there. Early in the morning, David left the flock in the care of a shepherd, loaded up, and set out as Jesse directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines, facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of the supplies, ran to the battle lines, and asked his brothers how they were. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance as David heard it. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. Now the Israelites had been saying, "Do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give him his daughter in marriage and will exempt his family from taxes in Israel." Hey, that's
the first example of marriage for tax breaks.
Yeah, exactly. Good point. I would try it for tax breaks. Not sure about the daughter. David asked the men standing near him, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" They repeated to him what they had been saying and told him, "This is what will be done for the man who kills him." When Elah, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, "Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave these few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle." Why would Elah make this charge? Anybody know? Same thing in his heart that's in our young men's hearts that play war games all the time. I'm not sure that's so wicked. It's kind of naturally in the heart of a young man to want to fight, go to war, defend, all of that kind of stuff. Maybe it's one thing that makes them a bit different than the female side of things. I think his brother didn't like this little kid. Do you remember what had happened earlier? Yeah, you think some jealousy's going on here, maybe? I think so, maybe. Now what have I done?" said David. "Can't I even speak?" He then turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter, and the men answered him as before. When what David said was overheard and reported to Saul, and Saul sent for him. David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant," meaning I'll go and fight him. Saul replied, "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off his sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion, the paw of the bear, will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around, because he was not used to them. "I cannot go in these," he said to Saul, "because I'm not used to them." So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, or the brook, one translation says, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand, approached the Philistine. Meanwhile, the Philistine with his shield bearer in front of him kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw he was little more than a boy, glowing with health, handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I'll give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it's not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine in the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from the sheath. After he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. Then the men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout and pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gath and to the gates of Ekron, which is west toward the Mediterranean. Their dead were strewn along the Shaaraim road to Gath and Ekron. When the Israelites returned from chasing the Philistines, they plundered their camp. David took the Philistines' head and brought it to Jerusalem. He put the Philistines' weapons in his own tent. As Saul watched David going out to meet the Philistines, he said to Abner, commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is that young man?" Abner replied, "As surely as you live, your majesty, I don't know." The king said, "Find out whose son this young man is." As soon as David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul, with Saul still holding the Philistine's head. "Whose son are you, young man?" Saul asked him. David said, "I am the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem." 1 Samuel 17. So, the battle is the Lord's. Our limitations do not prove to be limitations if what we do have is in the hands of God. Once again, we can go far beyond what it seems humanly possible to do with our life. If we're surrendered to God, and if we're courageous, if our faith is in God, our enemies can be put to flight. They're not people, but they're temptations, they're situations, they're circumstances in our life sometimes that seem bigger than a giant, or the giant Goliath. And others may capitulate or run or tremble. God wants us to stand up against our temptations, our problems, our circumstances with great courage and faith. Because it's not what we can get done, it's what God can get done with and through us. Anybody want to make any comments or ask any questions? I know we're all very familiar with this.